Welcome back, friends, fellow philosophers, and authors, to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have with me Matt Dawson. How are you, Matt?
Doing pretty good. How are you?
As good as I can do this late in the evening. Uh, we were just talking before we started here. I might not be as ultra quick as I'm never ultra quick, as less sluggishly slow as I usually am, but we'll make the best of it. And today we're going to be talking about writing across various mediums. If you did not know, which uh, many of you may not, Matt has a lot of experience writing for games. Is that right, Matt?
That's accurate. I actually write the scripts for my games, and I also develop them. So I have multiple perspectives on that.
Look at this, a multifaceted man, a type of modern day Renaissance man writing across fiction and game script writing and developing. Do you do the artwork as well, like the sprite art? I think I've seen sprite art images, things like that.
Yeah, I do pretty much everything. So I do the pixel art. I've dabbled in 3D a little bit, but I don't know if it's my forte. And I also make the music for it, which I haven't really posted a lot of yet. I'm still kind of getting used to, but yeah.
So you make the music as well. So you didn't even mention that. That's actually really, really impressive. At least I think that's amazing. Uh, We'll get into it as we get in. But before we start, I want to do a bit of shilling. First off, for those of you listening, if you want to participate in this podcast or series of podcasts called the Writing Cast, you can. If you can get into contact with me, if I know of you in some way, shape, or form, you're not some just random stranger. I am fully willing to welcome you on. I'd love to have a conversation. I'm going to list through a few topics that are still left. They're dropping like flies. I have gotten way more participation than I could have ever hoped for. So if you're interested, you should contact me some way, shape, how quickly. So what we have left in terms of topics, we have delving into the depths, theme as thesis, symbols and meta narratives versus motifs. So it's a conversation about theme. We have the author spake upon the face of the waters, discussing setting as world building, backdrop, and character. Because I always wanted to really discuss that because I never really got the setting as character all the way. Narrative voice, potence or pretense. Questions like what is style or narrative voice, and is quality prose objectively so? We have regression to the mean, the rules of writing, bell curves, and Pareto distributions. Really, what that conversation is about is when the rules apply and when they don't, when they'll help you and when they'll make you worse. We have art versus escapism, narratives as nourishment or decadence. Exactly what that sounds like. We have when is the weeb always wrong? This will be kind of related to today's conversation, discussing narrative devices present or absent in anime and manga, which harm the new author's stories. Because while I do believe there are some things that are helpful, like any medium, there are also some things that do not cross apply. And we might touch on a little bit of that here and there with our conversation. We have the nature of villainy, what makes a villain, and why do people choose evil. And new to the list, we have reader rights versus justified writing. When is the author or reader in the wrong? This conversation I hope to have about when readers make mistakes in reading, which might be a bit of a controversial topic. I think a lot of people assume, well, if I didn't get it, then your writing was just bad. Though I will say I've had and seen people claim that a thing wasn't in a paragraph and then have it be pointed out like, look, it's right here, here's the sentence, you just didn't read it because you were skimming. Anyway, that's a personal bugbear of mine. Also, before we begin, I'm going to shill my site where you can listen to the other podcasts in this series, wildislelit.com slash podcast will get you there. If you're also looking for some fiction, I have a novel out, Juan Smoke Broken, a kind of weird, let's say, weird fantasy fiction with an American twist, as Brad described in our first podcast. It reads a little bit like a cross between fantasy, western, and a literary novel, if that makes any sense. Also, last on the list to shill is my editing service, a Wild Isle Style Guide, where I focus on editing your manuscript according to stylistic goals, particularly in reference to far flung and forgotten works. I like reading a lot of books from the old pulp era and the 20s, 30s, 40s after. but also the classics, and then mixing that in with a little bit of contemporary work. If you could benefit from upping your style game, then go to my website, wideowlet.com/editing, and see if some of my editing services are right for you. Uh, all right, I think that's all for me. Matt, do you have anything you want to throw out there?
Yeah, but if you want to kind of follow some of my game dev and novel work, you can catch me on Twitter at Forgotten ADV.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Okay, so now we can actually get into today's conversation, spirit channeling and storytelling across various mediums. Uh, just to start out, so you've mentioned that you've done script writing for games, and I know that you've taken your hand at writing at least one novel. So give me your whole spectrum of experience with writing across all the different mediums that you've participated in.
Sure. So most of it will be amateur. I don't think there's much in my way of publishing yet. But so I started out kind of just writing novels based off of D&D campaigns that I had created. That's kind of where the world that I've been writing for stems from. So I've actually done a number of different, at least text only formats there. So, I've done short stories, I've done novelettes, and I've written a couple of novels, most of which haven't seen the light of day yet. I have to level up my editing skills there. But I've kind of had an interest in a number of different formats. So I played around with comics and writing a comic script. Um, and then not really recently, but I've always had an interest in making games. Actually, even before I started writing seriously. So just kind of coming up with little stories, building text adventures, which is effectively interactive fiction in digital format. Uh, Coming out from there, I, I kind of look at writing a short story and writing a game effectively the same thing. So even like a medium like television or movies are kind of in the same vein as a game script for the most part. I mean, games are a little bit more interactive for sure, but ultimately the message that comes across is fairly short. So I'd say I haven't written a movie script, but I've seen plenty of movie scripts and just out of interest. Um, and they're pretty much the same thing. Like I would say that's a pretty well. They're all pretty analogous across the board there.
Christ, man, there's so many things I want to jump in. I'll see if I can keep it in order. I probably won't be able to. I want to start from the beginning of what you said, which is that you started out with your writing experience with Dungeons and Dragons. Would you
Yes.
believe? Yeah, would you believe that I have the same origins? I bet plenty of you listeners also do. Was, if I remember right, so it went from D&D to like trying to write short stories. Do I remember that right?
Yes. So at least my text oriented, I guess that's a I don't even know that's a good way to put it. Um, Journey kind of went from D&D to like short stories and slightly longer texts for sure. Yes.
So the question that comes in is, uh, what was both the motivation to go from merely, I don't want to say merely like putting it down, but from merely writing, you'd say, I don't know, D&D adventures or settings, or there's many different, spots of writing you could do. Like I know I even wrote a whole rules system before I tried to write my first novel, which was a disaster. But what was the motivation, and what was the experience of moving from the tabletop role playing writing to your first iterations of shorter fiction?
Yeah. So I think it's well the impetuous was that um, a lot of the feedback I got from my campaigns was like, "Wow, this is a really elaborate world. You've got to write something about it. Write a novel. Write something." I heard a lot of feedback from that, and that kind of lit a fire under me to just kind of move forward and try and put something down in a more linear fashion. So I'd always been when I was real young. I was always a fan of like the Forgotten Realms. So um, basically, I was really excited about some of the lore that came out of the novels, like Drizzt and things of that nature. I was super familiar with like the geography and the history and all that stuff. Um, but it felt like the more that I customized these campaigns that I played in my earlier days, it felt more foreign. Like I just didn't really match. I didn't really match up with the setting for some reason. I couldn't really put my finger on it, but the things I made felt like they were really standing out against everything that had been created for the setting otherwise. So like I just kind of decided to close the book on that and said I'll take a stab at building my own, build my own world, figure out something, build my own history, and for the most part I'll understand it just as well because I'll have made it. So I started
Now,
doing that, and I kind of focused on um, more of my DM style. So the world and the DM style kind of is one to one in effect because at least in D&D there's kind of, I would say, like three main categories of DMs. There's like the player versus player, where like the DM versus the actual players. Like the DM is out to destroy all the PCs. Um, there's uh, the kind of rules monger, like you could do anything you want, but you're going to follow my story, and you kind of get railroaded along this narrative. Um, but the third one, which is kind of where I think I lie, is the collaborative storyteller. So, like focusing in on that, like what's a collaborative storyteller? Like the rules are kind of a little bit mushy, right? As long as it fits the narrative that like everybody's telling and everybody's kind of on the same page, it works. And that's kind of where the setting kind of emerged from the nebula on that one.
so many questions. So the one that's at the tip of my tongue now, I'm curious if you had a similar experience. So when I shifted from writing for tabletop games to actually trying my hand at fiction, one of my motivations, because I also wanted to have a kind of collaborative storytelling, was not being able to tell the story quite as well as I wanted to, with in my case, sorry, friends, but the players that I had were not always facilitative of narrative. They were a motley crew. They all had different interests in the game. Some people liked it as a kind of tactical combat simulator. Some were more interested in the stories. Others were more of a completionist nature, and so they weren't very, let's say, collaborative. They would want to be railroaded, if you will. So I had people all along that spectrum that you just described. So for your experience, were your players cooperative with you, or were they not so much, and did that push you toward, uh, other than the encouragement you mentioned before, push you toward the short stories?
Um, well, as far as the players, uh, wow, I'm trying to recount how many people. Let's just say there's dozens, dozens of campaigns I've gone through with various unique people that had come through, especially my college years. Um, I would say I've seen all kind of walks of life like that, and I tend to have a style that would lean more towards what the group is wanting. Right? There's kind of the group that has a collaborative. There's a party, right? I guess in so many words, there's the party that exists, and they're kind of one spirit, so to speak. And there's going to be, regardless of any one individual within the party, there's going to be a specific drive towards a style. And with that, I kind of read the room. So I'm my strength as a DM is improv. I can jot notes down. I can kind of come up with specific scenarios on the fly, and I kind of know where I want to go and sort of like understand where we are. But if there's a gigantic loop de loop and there's a barrel roll and maybe they go all the way around the wrong way and come all the way down and around and boom, they land kind of near where they need to be. Perfect. Everybody had fun, and it was a really interesting story because nobody was sitting there going, "When do we get there?" um, sort of thing. So sometimes, at least in my style, you have to take the reins and tell part of the story. Like there's going to be gaps, and everyone's like, "Where do we go? What do we do?" There's going to be an NPC that walks up and is like, "Clearly, you have to do this." And if they decide to kill them instead of actually listening to the NPC, um, you just kind of pick it up from there. And oh no, you've killed someone of importance or something.
Now, this is the question I was going to ask earlier. I'm glad I got a chance to ask it. So, did this skill with improvisation, did to me sounds like there's the the creativity, the imagination that kind of is both able to put itself forth and wants to put itself forth, that led to a deviation from the source material, in terms of, I know you mentioned the novels around the Forgotten Realm setting amongst others. What is my question? My question is, did did that, let's say, that will to deviation push you, not will to deviation, I guess imagination is a better word, push you to deviate? And then did you have other source materials that were also, let's say, influencing you to move away from the standard material, or the things that you saw provided?
I would say that would looking back, it would be one of the components of it. Um, like I said before, I was really into just kind of the lore, the world, so I can make up kind of something. As far as like the pre-configured settings of Forgotten Realms, but I think ultimately I kind of started compiling throughout my career. I kind of started compiling a bunch of these stories that we had done, and there would be kind of these in memes of a lot of the people who would come back to play repeatedly, like a lot of my friends and acquaintances who would come back to start a new campaign. Hey, you're starting. All right, sweet. Um, and there was always kind of like the in jokes and the memes and things of that nature before they were memes, like in the more academic sense meme that
Yeah.
that I kind of started to see this world forming regardless. So like I have this big folder, is this big ratty manila folder full of just the stories I had written, the notes I had written, and even like once in a while I would spread them out and just kind of reread them just because they were fun memories, and I'd be like, oh, this could be related to this and that could be related to that, and suddenly you have the framework for a whole new world. And that's, like, you look at it and it's just kind of out of place for the setting, but then there's this whole new setting that was kind of organically created and it feels natural in its own isolation.
Did any of those settings make it all the way to your shorter fiction, or perhaps your novels, as we progress the conversation that way? So let's talk about that. Like, did anything carry over into the short stories and or the novels, and what was the progression like going from shorter to longer form fiction?
Sure. So I would say you actually have read about one or two of the characters that have carried over. Like there's a number of characters that I have that actually have survived a lot of things. And there's been a whole number of reckonings where I would, cut out specific stuff. Everything that exists in my fiction is the stuff that I've made. Like I've made an NPC for a specific reason. I like that NPC so much I fleshed them out. I fleshed them out, and I really began to kind of love what they're about and their growth or their inevitable fall from grace, depending on what context we're talking about. Um, and so I would just kind of plant that seed and let it naturally grow. So like as there's a lot of work I haven't published, but it's still valuable work. So when we move into like the short story realm, for instance, um, in the very beginning, like that's kind of what I view the early days as like the first era. There was always this kind of origin story that I had. And there's a natural problem with having an origin story in my setting, but I'll get to that in a moment. Um, there was this uh, origin story, so to speak, where everything begins. Like this is the event that starts everything. It's the spark. Um, Inherently, that is kind of the origin story for everything now. Because it's not because I'm like, oh, that was an amazing story I wrote. No, I hate that story. I go back to it and I realize how bad of a writer I used to be, and I still am today. Um, but I like the idea and the origin, like the premise of it is so simple. It's easy to move away from bad execution into a better execution, um, just by by analyzing the core components and bringing it into a new context.
See, that's really interesting because what you've just essentially drawn a line through there is the fact that there can be an idea or a notion, even a story, what I would call well, it's not only the content component, but I like to differentiate between content and composition. And some of the content perhaps was a little bit rough, especially if this was something, in your early days. I mean, hell, uh, anyone out there, by the way, if you're just starting out and you feel like you suck, two things. You probably do, but so does everybody else at that stage for like usually a really long time, so don't feel bad. But yeah, so you've outlined there is a difference between the idea of an event. In your case, it sounds like you've got like almost like not necessarily literally a civilization starter, but like a story that, let's say, really brings the narrative into being. And then, or not narrative, I should say the setting in large scope. By setting, like the setting with a certain cast of characters with certain cultures in a world that then you've, let's say, taken the vague notions of from the original story, and from that begun to build, let's say, across what it sounds like across mediums. So let's see if I can get the memory right. So you moved into, you've got a bunch of short fiction, and you've got some, whole novels that you've written that are unpublished. And was it comics that you moved into next? Is that right?
So somewhere between short stories and jumping into novels, I wanted to try my hand at kind of doing the whole enterprise of drawing comics. This was way back when, um, let's just say 15, 20 years ago, maybe. Um, that I decided I kind of wanted to start to learn how to draw. I wanted to write these comics. I had these ideas. I was really big into comics and manga and all this stuff. So like it was really influential at the time. And I got a little bit discouraged only because I could definitely see when you're in a visual medium, it's very hard to take like what you're producing and compare it to other works. And there was a definite huge disparity. And that was pretty discouraging for me. It's a bad thing to have though. Like one of the best pieces of advice I'd ever got, at least for as far as visual medium, is probably true for everything, is that your eye is always going to be more talented than your hand. You'll always be able to see better than you'll be able to create. So if there's any one piece of advice I could kind of send out to the world is, it's always going to look worse um, than it really is, effectively, because your taste is more refined than the ability than what you can make, which makes sense. You can't make something better than your own tastes.
Yeah, I think especially if you go from something like written to visual, in truth, essentially all of the art forms have an astronomical learning curve. But there's something deceptive about writing because we all like learn to write in school, and so the level of entry for writing is really, really low. And then the learning curve for good writing is like really, really, really high, but it's kind of hard to tell where you are until like you put yourself immediately against somebody else, which hardly happens because, you know, uh, unless you go and grab your favorite novel off the shelf, put it like literally next to your work and read back and forth. Your mind doesn't really compare, but when it's visual, the stark the stark contrast between one's own work and one's other, that's got to be cripplingly demoralizing. So I liked what you said there. The eye is was it the eye is more refined than the hand? Is that right?
Yeah, it'll always be more refined than the hand.
How much
Absolutely.
progression how much progression did you get with your drawing ability? Because I imagine that had to have been like a huge endeavor. Like it's just really difficult to draw at all.
Yeah, it's actually something I've been refining over over the course of my life. Basically, most of my family on my mom's side are artists. Like they do it for professionally. Um, and like I was kind of the black sheep. I was really more into like math and science, and like that was just what I was good at school. Like I would come home with like, sweet, I've got A's and B's in all of these hard science and mathematics. And then I'd come home with like the art, and they'd be like, "What is this? Come on, you could do better than that." It's like, um, so it's just kind of a focus of mine where I understand how high that bar is because I've always seen I've always had people around me who have excelled at it, and I kind of fall short for one reason or another. But something I've always pursued.
Now, with their time, because you mentioned this was kind of between the short stories and the novels, is and probably ongoing, like you mentioned, you're developing or not developing in say becoming more engaged with visual mediums. Uh, what I want to ask is in relation to what I call the considerations across mediums, and we're probably going to come back and touch on these, but it's a good time to bring them up. So, in for those who don't know who are listening, the term imagery, academically speaking, they could have come up with a better word. The academics usually fuck things up, but this is the word they use, so we're going to use it. Refers to actually all sensory considerations or sensory stimuli that you could evoke or trigger within the reader. So it's like visual, auditory, olfactory, so that's smell, taste, tactile, so that's touch. And there's other internal things we could talk about as well in terms of feelings and emotions. But across that spectrum of sensory detail, did you notice, or I should say, what did you notice, trying your hand with comics as a visual medium, moving between written mediums, if at all, because you might have just been overwhelmed by the process of learning and practicing drawing itself, which would have been a momentous endeavor.
For sure. Um, it was actually so I kind of have a process where I just kind of throw myself at into whatever I'm trying to learn, and just kind of live as that um, vocation, so to speak. And I got really big into like Will Eisner literature, like writing sequential art is the type is pivotal work, I would say. And so sequential comics are effectively sequential art. Um, and so there's kind of two buckets there. I would say that writing short stories is a critical component if you want to write comics. And this is coming from amateur. I just want to preface this. This is just a lot of assumption. But if we're looking at like kind of the greats, and that's subjective, clearly. Um, there is clearly a knack for short stories in a lot of these works. So my some of my favorite, let's just say manga. It's long running. Was at the time when I was doing this, Claymore was being published in the United States, so I'm gonna date myself on that one. But yeah, Claymore is effectively in one line a story about a secret league of women who take in demon blood in order to hunt demons, and it's a story about one specific hunter who isn't entirely half demon; she's a quarter demon, but that gives her different powers, and it just kind of goes into this like that. Like there are these huntresses, and it goes much deeper, and it's kind of a medieval setting. It was very cool at the time. Um, so there's kind of like two buckets for at least comics. It's the visual aspect. Like if you're going to be drawing people, you have to kind of understand mannerisms and anatomy, and like communicate. How do you make a fictional character communicate non-verbally? How do you make them communicate verbally? There's other different components like how do you assemble the series of these communications into a realistic um did I repeat myself sequence? I'll just repeat myself. Sequence. How do you communicate a series of these nonverbal and verbal cues into a sequence of meaningful uh, fiction? And that's really what a comic is on the art side, is just, when do they say something? When do they do something? How do they do it? Like if they're being timid, if they're being aggressive, if they're being um, as a writer, you have words, like you could describe it. You can show not tell, which is really just tell in a different way. Um, tell in a different way or tell. But with visual art, there's a lot more to convey because there's a lot more nuance to at least the human form. Um, and even if you're drawing animals, if you're drawing even just nature, right? Drawing animals, they're going to be there's clearly a way to draw an aggressive dog or a scared dog or a happy dog. Um, pick your other mammals or fish or really anything else in the world. You have to have that sort of visual library in your head in order to convey that. And the same for trees, right? If you want to draw a tree, you can draw a really healthy tree. It's got a lot of big branches and leaves. Or it's a dead tree, like the branches are broken and it's dangling and, you know, hung over, almost about touching the ground from the top. You know what I mean? So there's that visual library that also has to exist to the artist. But then there's also the writing, right? You can have a fantastic visual library that you can draw upon and maybe build fantastic portraits, create fantastic portraits, fantastic landscapes that tell the story without words. You can definitely do that. There's tons of artists right now who are um, that are actually killing it. Just posting on social media these portraits, these landscapes, concept art, things of that nature. But if we're talking about sequential art, there's also the writing. There has to be some sort of uh, script in order to tell these stories. So that's where kind of the short story comes in. And long running comics, we'll just say comics for now, do have arcs, right? That's kind of a, I don't want to say it's a trope. It's actually just a feature of the comic book itself. Like if you have a series of comic books, there's going to have at least one arc. If it's a long running comic, there's probably going to be multiple arcs. Um, and then I would say each of those arcs are probably a short story, maybe a novelette or a novella, if they're depending on who's making them. On average, it's probably a short story, I would say.
Yeah, so we're seeing the inevitability of, let's say, just individual plot arcs essentially, because when we say arc, really what we're short for is plot arc. And um if you happen to catch the podcast that should release before a week before this one, we talk all about plot arcs and Freytag's triangle. But really, in any story structure, you have one of these, and oftentimes you have a bunch of them. So there's no wonder in a visual medium you're going to have probably more than one, because when you've got, when you're, I don't want to use the word compressing, but when you're storytelling through images and you're taking all of those details that normally have to be presented um, through, I would say, written description, would say, if we're writing a short story, you you run into, when you're writing it, I should say this, when you're writing it in a short story, you have to do things, well, like you mentioned before, at a different context sequentially, right? Like I have to decide when I'm going to describe what and what's going to go in the dialogue and what I'm going to exposit, and um, precisely what am I going to order when, and there's lots of considerations, but you can't do it all at once. Whereas if I am, let's say, if I had the ability to do a comic, I am. showing the expression, having the gesture happen. Also, they might be doing something while they're having that gesture with a particular facial expression or bodily expression of emotion. And then you've got multiple characters potentially in a single panel. So you've got, a multitude, what might take a couple pages in a short story, you could actually potentially show in a panel or two. And that is going to essentially bring plot arcs to a close much more efficiently, because I think it was Ezra Pound, some quote I saw in one of my textbooks when I was teaching literature, talked about how when you're dealing with images, now he was talking about with poetry, but this in case literal images, you have this ability to transcend time and that you aren't limited by the sequential nature of writing. And that's what lends to that necessity of plot arcs, which gives the relationship to, let's say, visual mediums like comics and short stories. Does that all sound correct? I kind of might have been talking beyond myself there.
That sounds pretty accurate. One thing I would point out as just an interesting feature is that in, let's just say, text in general, novel or short story, what have you, um, the inverse is true for comic. Like there's kind of an inverse relationship. Um, Dialogue is extremely easy in a novel. Let's just say, you could go on for pages and pages about this conversation regarding whatever, and there's no problem there. Like it actually kind of speeds along the pacing a little bit. In a comic, it's the inverse. A lot of text is quite difficult because you only have so much space on a cell, and for every cell, for every line of dialogue, you have this back and forth with. You're going to have to draw a new frame, and there's always shortcuts and things of that nature, but there adds kind of an exponential um, component to having a discussion versus action, whereas the inverse is true for uh, writing a novel, where you can talk for pages and pages, no problem, but action will feel slow unless you're very careful with your words and you understand the pacing and where to describe things and where not to describe things, in order to give the reader a clear picture of what's occurring. So there's an interesting, I guess maybe it's not inverse, but asymmetry between those two.
Yeah, so that relates to something I wanted to ask earlier. I'm going to say that quite a lot. So both you mentioned having to consider lots of, let's say, nonverbal communication, expression by the characters, etc. That's all contained visually, and then you just mentioned the dialogue needing to be concise in such a way that it can fit within the panels but still communicate everything that you wanted to communicate. Did you find that working within both of those restraints, where you have to think about those things because the medium is visual, that it improved your ability to write those when you went back to a purely text medium?
It, I don't know if it would really improve it. I definitely bits and pieces of it stuck with me, and I don't know if that's a good thing or not. At least in my writing, I find that I'm overly short, and sometimes I omit things that shouldn't be. And I find kind of my drafts are frail, which means I probably missed some description, or there was some meaningful action that was understated in some way, shape, or form, and that might be because I experimented with that before I really dove headfirst into writing novels. Um, so there could definitely be a correlation there.
That's really interesting because what that suggests is that, however this is being processed in the mind and the brain, or however the creative process is working, um, the let's say the abilities might both be there, but it's difficult to cross apply them for some reason. Why do you think that might be?
So I think I'm pretty much a visual person in general. So when I think about a scene, and I've gotten this feedback a lot, and it's something I try and wrap myself on the knuckles. When I think about a scene, I kind of think about the placement of how things are, the mechanics, before I think about the relationships between characters occurring. So, for instance, I got some good feedback on one of my manuscripts where the intro felt like it was kind of uh, an opening movie shot where it was big, sprawling out, wide out into this place where it could have probably been more better. Oof. Uh, Probably been better interspersed between some action, things of that nature. So um, at least in my first drafts, it does slip in where like I think about the imagery and I think about the wares. Even going back, I'm thinking about some of the feedback I received that was most impactful when I started writing, and that was still true. Like the most meaningful feedback I got, and this is going to be 100% like, oh, clearly this is why. But um, I had this basically this origin story, which is a little bit longer than the short story I spoke about earlier. And the feedback I got was it the setting feels great. It feels like I can explore this as a D&D character, but it's not meaningful to the pacing of the story.
That's a good segue into talking about writing for games because the interactive component, yeah, I
Mhm.
think is the hinge there, right? Like there's something that the interaction between the player and the game fills that it you can't leave empty when it comes to let's say a written non-interactive narrative. Um, so we'll hold on to that question because I'm curious. I am curious what, or you can answer it right away. It doesn't matter, but I'm curious
Sure.
what that is. What it is that the interactivity fills that is normally there. Um, in let's say just a written work or even perhaps in a comic, right, or in a film. I imagine that interactive component, it needs to be filled in other visual mediums like film as well. So we've got that to consider. What is that interactivity, and how does it, what do you need to put there when the medium isn't interactive? And then more generally, we can talk about your shift into script writing for games and all the other, tasks, the momentous tasks of doing the art and the sound and everything else that comes with game design.
Sure. So I think the main difference between, let's just say, video games and previous mediums, so previous mediums includes movies, et cetera, is that the player has to have a problem to solve. So you have to have a problem solving component in the art in order to for it to really be a video game. There are things like visual novels, which is uh, by my definition not really a game, and I'm sorry to anyone who makes visual novels, that's not true. But by my definition, if there's no problem solving, it's not really a game. So what does that mean in terms of like character development? It means that the player is invested in the character because the character is a part of themselves. So if we look at a comic, the the reader can get invested in it because they've been a part of the journey, right? They've seen the growth, they've seen the change, they've seen the wins and the losses, and effectively, I would say it's because you're on the same team as the hero, right? You're part of the hero's team. You've been there. You were there for everything. Sweet. Um, when uh, when I'm thinking about something like playing a game, and I specifically make RPGs for the most part, so that's when I'm thinking about like old school JRPGs on the Super Nintendo. If you're familiar with that, um, you are the player. I mean, you are the character effectively because without the player, there is no character. the The story would not happen without somebody sitting there and actually executing that series of events. Some Recently there's been a big push for like open-ended worlds where the story's kind of yours to tell. Um, and we can kind of jump into that later if you'd like. But I'm just talking about sequential games where there is a predefined series of events that occurred, and there are potential gatekeeps between them. So some example of a gatekeep would be levels. So you would have to get stronger. Your character would have to get stronger in order to get to that next event. Um, and that might involve defeating a boss or collecting items, which might be behind scary monsters. Um, those are some examples, like some early video game RPG sort of examples of problem solving. Uh, with the advent of 3D and more the ability to simulate physics, there's things like it's not an RPG, but something like Portal, where it's physical. Like you have the ability to make portals, which could transport you from A to B and back through this effective rift in reality. Uh, that's still problem solving. It's just not, an RPG.
Yeah, so from what you've said there, what it sounds like is the player brings to the table something that isn't present in these other mediums, and that in particular is motivation. And that motivation is part of the design structure of the game. I don't know, like if you're playing an RPG, maybe you want to get to the end of the story, maybe you want to get to like level 100 or whatever the max level is, defeat the bosses, maybe you want to collect all the items. I don't know if you're playing Animal Crossing or something, you want to like pay off your fucking house. Um, there's lots of things. You're playing a shooter, you're motivated, right, to, kill the enemies, get a high score, play, defeat people online, whatever the game is, it's got in its fundamental structure, um, let's say a thing for the player who coming to the game is assumedly already interested in achieving that, right? Like you kind of you'll buy the game or play the game that has the thing that you want or is offering you something you want, and you kind of bring that to the character, um, and therefore you are automatically invested. There's automatically something at stake, right? There's a reason to grind, to level up, to get to the new area because you already want to get there. You already want to see what's there and to overcome it. Uh,
I,
whereas if we were, did you want to say something?
nope, sorry, go ahead.
So whereas if we're writing fiction, what would go there is essentially the singular, or not necessarily singular, I shouldn't say that, the motivations and the values of the character central to the plot, or characters central to the plot. So whereas the reader brings the motivation, I want to get over here. If I'm writing a novel, I have to, let's say, do two things to fill that void. Um, Firstly, I need to have a character who cares about getting, let's say, over there to the next area, right? For some reason, that reason needs to be convincing to the reader, and that gets to my second thing that I need to do, other than give the, let's say, the protagonist a certain motivation, is I have to make the reader care about the protagonist's motivation. Typically, this is through making a somewhat sympathetic or just very intriguing, interesting character. You can do this through plot more than you can character as well, like a murder mystery. It's really a murder mystery actually is kind of more like a game than it is like a typical character driven novel, in that the reader is participating, trying to figure it out as the narrative progresses. And that's kind of interesting because I didn't really think about that. But that would be the void that gets filled um, by, let's say, the player being a player interacting with the medium. And so your considerations for game design in terms of content are going to change a little bit because you need to prioritize, let's say, things in the game itself that are, let's say, desired not just by the characters, though they should still be desirable for the characters, but also for the people you intend to pitch the game to. Does that sound all about right?
To some degree, I would say that games, the hook for games and the hook for a story are more similar than different. It's just the what rather than the how. So when you want to try and hook a reader, you need to have something impactful in the beginning, and it could be an emotion, it could be a an idea, it could be just plain old action. You need to have a solid hook in order to sell the reader. Like, we have a story. This is worth reading, and you need it within however many words or pages. I know it does vary a little bit, and it's also something I'm working on. So I don't think I can speak authoritatively on that. But I think the hook uh, for a game is very similar, and I think it ties into exactly what you're speaking to about motivation. So there's kind of the two facets to both a book and a game, and that's the marketing. When you're going into a game or a book, you don't know what's on the inside. That's not so true today. I mean, you could just there's read inside and things of that nature. But for the most part, you don't know what's really going to be entailed. You're going to have to get sold on it. So you have the blurbs and you have the cover art and maybe a few intro pages of the beginning to get you hooked. Let's just say you nail that part. Um, Fantastic. Let me re-roll that. I did that wrong. You might not nail the hook because but you have a great marketing, which means they've at least paid the entry fee to consume the art. And I'm noticing kind of a pattern between let's just say genre fiction and games today, where there's a lot of context setting. There's not a lot of hook. Um, so in a game, at least modern games today, is one of the many gripes I have about games, is that it doesn't start you in the middle of the action. If you pick up Doom from 1993 and press start and pick your difficulty, you're dropped in the middle of the game. There's nothing else to it. There was the demo screen in the beginning of the game, which kind of got you hyped about what might actually happen during the gameplay, but that's not happening to you. You're just watching a demo screen go on. So you press three buttons and you're in the game. You start moving around and figuring out your world. That's it. Everything else is up to you to figure out what's going on and piece together like why things are happening. Um, Doom 20, I'm sorry, the second Doom Eternal, starts out with a cutscene. You press start, you select your difficulty, you're thrown into a 30-second, maybe 45-second cutscene. It's a good cutscene. It's a decent hook. The music is great. It does get you hyped. But if that cutscene falls flat, let's just put it in theoretical terms, if you decide to go with a cutscene and it falls flat for whatever reason, you've lost your hook, in my opinion. The gameplay might be great, but you've just kind of soured the rest of the experience by having kind of a mid or even bad, um, uncontrollable event. Which I've kind of noticed that people have been skipping story lately in games. Like I watch a lot of popular streamers play games, and they're just like, whatever, story, cool, great, ba 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 ba. Which is strange because a lot of games sell themselves on their own stories. So there's something amiss there. But I'll go back to the other side of the coin, which is writing. And I've noticed that there's a lot of context setting in the writing as well, where um, it starts big to small. Like we start with this big, world building dialogue, monologue, what have you. Um, and we're not really in any sort of reality. We just are trying to build this world from the ground up rather than um, using common experience to develop it. It's one of the reasons like I couldn't get into Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time starts out with this decent prologue. I mean, it's kind of this image of madness, but after that, like it's kind of like this farm boy out in the middle of nowhere, and like what's going on. You know what I mean? It didn't really work for me, and
Okay, so let me pro
Wheel of Time's pretty old. So I'll put it. Wheel of Time's pretty old, but I've noticed it in modern fiction because they kind of inherits from that in modern fantasy. Sorry.
no, you're fine. Let me process all that because there's quite a lot to touch on. What's at the most forefront of my mind? There are two game. series, franchises, whatever you want to call them, that meet with what you've just described. So I'll start with the Elder Scrolls. So I got introduced with Morrowind um, when I was, I think, in middle school when I started playing that. Um, and in Morrowind, there's not, it reminds me of your description of Dune. There's not really a tutorial. I mean, kind of. There's like a couple text boxes if you choose to pick up like the dagger or the lockpick, and they kind of make you take a ring out of a barrel. But like you can get through that text box in like 2 seconds, and you walk out in the world, and you're just here. You are. Go do something. Like, um, whereas if I think of the as let's say the games developed, the tutorials got longer and longer. I think Skyrim is notorious for having this just awful, long, very cinematic, very boring and kind of dry um, cutscene before you even get up to your freaking character creation, which takes forever. So I definitely with games have seen, let's say, it's kind of interesting the reverse of what you just described with some stories, though there's trends that I want to talk about there. But where with games, there's this slower start where uh, they are relying on essentially cinematic, like you mentioned, world building elements and setting more than getting you very quickly with the game equivalent of like a I don't want to call it like a narrative hook, but it kind of is the same thing. Here's the things that you're invested in, right? With the game, it's going to be tied up with the gameplay usually. The other franchise I wanted to mention that follows not necessarily the same exact pattern, but I'm a very big fan of the Dark Souls series. I unfortunately did not start with Demon Souls. I never really owned a PlayStation after the PlayStation 2, so I didn't play Demon Souls. But I was very invested into, let's say, the lore and the story of the first game, and not as much in the subsequent titles. Is that the same problem that I saw with the Elder Scrolls? No, I didn't find that they overloaded you with extra long tutorial and narrative in those games. But I did feel that the storytelling through the gameplay got weaker and not stronger over time, for whatever reason. And then jumping into crossing course into fiction. So yeah, with older fiction, you have the long exposition. Sometimes you'll have like the big prologue that kind of sets the scene, but then you are bereft. Um, you're oftentimes bereft of something that is, let's say, emotionally, narratively engaging until you build back into the story. Though I will say with contemporary fiction, and I hesitate to use the term genre fiction, though I will for the sake of the listeners here. I do notice a trend because of modern publication to essentially scrap as much world building as possible in the beginning of a book, even a fantasy novel, where that's notorious, and to try to implement a kind of high stakes or high investment hook right away to the point where I know my own novel, um, which intersperses world building with the introduction of the two protagonists in the first chapter. I've had many people comment that it's world building heavy, uh, which perhaps it is compared to modern standards. I don't know. Um, but where to go from there. Do you have anything you want to say in response to my little ramble there, or do we want to move on?
Uh, the more I kind of consume modern media, the more I see the value of in medias res. Um, sometimes the best value you can bring to the person who's consuming your art is to get to the point as fast as possible. Um, I think that there is a weird obsession, at least in the mainstream, with having, for lack of a better term, a cinematic universe for everything. I'm kind of afraid when I go to buy my next lawnmower, there's going to be a cinematic universe for that I have to get invested in. So, um, like there, I understand why. There's ultimately value in having a large sequence of things that might interest a large group of people, and there's I think the old Marvel um, formula worked out. And it was just a point. It was a moment in time when everything was so big, and there was all of this speculation. People were so hyped about it that having something that large is was very lucrative. But now that everybody owns a franchise very similar, it's kind of like fast food restaurants. Everybody can make a burger and fries. What makes your burger and fries, or my burger and fries, or anybody's burger and fries special? So I think, at least in terms, there's value in just individual sequence. A series that isn't like ever branching and ever turning and twisting and interspersed and interrelated. Um, you know, Old convention, however long of a compendium, is probably going to be more valuable than having 30 series with 3 books that all have intertwines and interconnects and interspersing. Um, and I think that's kind of where I'm going with my stories, is that I'm probably going to end up retelling the same story through different mediums, be it video games or um, novels or short stories. But ultimately, um, I think I think where the trends are going, it's most valuable to have something that is very concrete. Like there's no like where do I start? Like you start at number one, you end at number n, and it doesn't matter what the medium is.
Yes, that's a drawback to more of a kind of concise linear storytelling mode rather than the interconnected web of a massive universe within a particular setting. Um, and yeah, I have seen that. I think a lot of that has to do with either copying people who have been successful, but also, frankly speaking, it has to do with money. So if you are able to have this massive spiderweb universe, regardless of the media you're writing in, medium, I should say, you're going to be able to, let's say, connect more customers, if you will. And the big hope is that if they buy one, they buy everything in your backlog, and then you've got this kind of passive income, and that's something that I think is definitely a motivating factor. I don't begrudge people that because most most people doing any of this are terribly poor, at least in regard to how much they make on their writing. So there's that. Before we run out of time, do you have a hard out, or can we keep going for a little bit?
I've got all the time.
All right. So I wanted to touch on particularly with game design, the differences similar to how we talked about with comics. So we already talked about visual for a while, so I'll jump to auditory sound. One thing I've run into whenever I've written anything is the frustration with really trying to communicate sound and how sound affects a reader. And I imagine with a game that there's a lot more freedom and a lot more effectiveness when using either music, whether that's just background music or like, you've got like your boss battle music versus general town music versus exploring, or if it's if you're recording character dialogue, you've got the exact tone of voice. But even if you're not recording a character dialogue, having certain sound effects come about in your game, I imagine that must really, really add a dimension that is difficult to do when you're just writing something down on a piece of paper, or even if you're doing a comic for that matter.
For sure. I would say there's two different problems there. So there's the sound design, like a set design, but then there's also the music. Those are kind of like two different uh, avenues, so to speak, to dictate the environment. So we'll talk about sound design first. Um, the types of sounds that are made, it both depends on the platform that that the game is being made for and what limitations there are. So, for instance, if you're making just an NES game, a Nintendo original Nintendo game, the sound output is going to be far limited versus making something for a modern PC today. Um, the sounds that get outputted, though, I've noticed an interesting trend in at least the indie community. I'm pretty big into 2D games still. I guess it's part of my age. It's a nostalgia, but I'm really big into pixel art games and smaller indie games. So the two that stand out most, at least when we're talking about sound design, is Undertale and Stardew Valley. Now, hopefully, in terms of this discussion, we can set aside fan bases for this one and just kind of talk about the quality of sound. So, Undertale in specific uses sampling very well to convey the sense. So when you hear someone talk, you'll have these. They're what they're called chip tunes. They're very low fidelity sound effects that occur. Um, Typically played like MIDI files are very small, compressed, limited files. Um, and the samples I've heard of are pretty funny. Like one of the characters is actually a sampled McDonald's commercial that's toned down and cut down. So each player, like each character, makes a specific sound as their text is rolling, and it's really interesting that even without words being formulated from the sounds, you could still get a sense of you know what they're composed of. Like there's a really um, doofy kind of skeleton character in this game, and he has a very deep voice. So he kind of sounds like Patrick if you think about it, something like that. Um, but he doesn't. There's no audible words. You're still reading it, but they make this very deep, uh, very deep timbre noise every time the words come out. And then there's uh, very high pitched noises for very high pitched characters, and there's a very specific quality um, to even just being limited to that. You don't have any sort of voice acting, but you can still convey voice using very carefully placed sounds. So I'm trying to tie it back to novel writing because, in my opinion, it's easier to convey the sound of a voice um, in writing just text, because you could just say baritone, or you can say it has a deep timbre, things of that nature. And it's pretty straightforward, very easy to convey that. Um, what might be challenging in writing text over a video game is kind of the environment. So when environments make noises, or maybe you have unorthodox or otherworldly things happening, it's a lot easier, I would say, in sound design to create maybe a decent analog, depending on what your limitations are in a video game, um, versus having to either compare or try and convey somehow this sound that's occurring and why it's meaningful to the character and why it's happening in general. Like, why is it meaningful to the plot?
Yeah, I want to jump in here because part of me wants to and the that's not the first because there's a lot there. But on terms of it being easier in prose to convey tone of voice and sound qualities of voice, um, here's how I'm going to try and push back. You can, let's say, merely state you can pull up a dictionary and look for words or a thesaurus and look for words to try and get the word that you want. But I've actually never found any of that satisfying. The only time I've ever had say, satisfying qualities of sound described, there's two different ways. One is in the dialogue itself, where the tone of voice self generates from the ways the person talks. So that's sometimes very difficult to achieve depending on how the dialect of the character comes across. The only other way is with very a very clever use of a combination of figurative language while also, if you can, finding words that sound in accord with the say connotations of the tone of voice that is also being described figuratively as it applies to dialogue. And just me having to fish that out of my brain, um that's very difficult to do. Like I hardly ever do it. I hardly ever see any authors do it ever, because the opportunity to do so is I find not there quite a lot. But I'm familiar with the little voice files from Undertale, and I can remember them, and I get the feeling immediately without any of that effort. Now, maybe I don't know how difficult it is to find the right tone to communicate the voice um, for a character in a game, but it would seem to me that maybe I'm just peculiar. Maybe I in particular am not satisfied, but like most people are. I don't know. And you can let me know what you think of that. Um, yeah, because I think that's the bigger one. The other one we could set aside. What do you think of my counter argument? Do you think I've got water, or does that not hold any water to you?
I agree with you at least as far as the sensation. Like for a writer, there's that challenge, right? But if we're going to break down, let's just break it down in terms of creation, like just stepping up a little bit, like at a higher level. As a writer, there's a lot of different challenges that is faced, like picking the right words, picking the right grammar structures, composing paragraphs in a meaningful way. But that's all under the purview of the writer. Um, Sound design is a whole different domain. So while yes, I agree with you 100% that um, Undertale has a fantastic way of conveying the tone of these characters and the voicing and all of that. I would say that's because the creator himself was a skilled sound designer. Like it was outside of the realm of writing in the terminal sense and more into audio storytelling, which is a completely different discipline. Which is kind of what I meant was um, if we're just talking about you know solo efforts, and even actually there's another thesis. I'm gonna tie this all together. We're gonna kind of go on a trip here. Um, there's a thesis that a lot of indie games are so impactful is because there's like one man shows uh, are easier to kind of convey these stories through video games. Let me rephrase that. That sounded weird. One man indie shows have a much easier time of telling these stories than these big box um, enterprises, so to speak. It's kind of why it feels like a lot of these big AAA games are a little bit more muddled than, say, a really tight, smaller game. And that's because of all of these different paradigms coming together in one uniform voice. When you have a whole bunch of people adding into this cauldron of a story, it becomes a little bit muddled, a little bit, say, disjointed. And the point I'm trying to say with easier is that you as a writer have to only care about the words you're putting on the page. When we're talking about the reader, yes, it's going to definitely be challenging to put the sound of uh, the character's voice in the head of someone who's reading silently without a, say, a narrator. Um, Versus a video game which can, clip sound and sample and form fit that specific sound to that specific event. Yes, to the reader, 100, or the consumer, 100% of the time, Undertale is probably going, maybe not 100%, 99.999% of the time, Undertale is going to probably beat out the average bit of genre fiction. Um, but as a writer, when we're talking about producing it, the idea there is you. only have to worry about the words on the page. You don't have to worry about where do you find the sound, what sample rate you're going to have to cut it at, how long you're going to play it, when you're going to play it, at what interval you're going to play it, so that it's not too annoying or too interspersed that it's forgettable. Um, it's an entirely different discipline there.
Yeah, in the second case, you have to learn two skill sets, both what does the character say, but then also the entire what I'm going to call like sound engineering. This is what it sounds like to me.
That's
Is it
sounds right.
yeah, so you have to double up there, and that would be a lot more difficult to do. You mentioned there's two different qualities, so like there was I can't remember the terms you used. The two different
Sound
what
design
do
and
you
music.
Yes, there we go. Because in the music bit, I wanna what that made me think of is actually a lack of music. So you mentioned Undertale, and to this day, when you kill all the enemies in an area, then suddenly I'm pretty sure if I remember it right, because I can still feel the feeling I felt. It's redundant, but whatever. The music I think just cuts, and a lot of the audio just cuts, and there's this eerie silence that feels wrong, like reminding you you're a fucking murderer for killing all the enemies in the area. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, so I'll put that out there as a starting point. But when you mention like the music and how it can affect the mood, like that's what comes to mind.
for sure. Like that's the other side of that same sound coin. Um, again another discipline. So I guess we're really talking about complexity of the mediums now. So like the music, 100%. If there were soundtracks to books, it would probably be double so more engaging. And that's the challenge is that as a writer, there's a lot of media today. Like look at any 10-second clip of YouTube short or a TikTok or what have you, Twitter video. It's moving imagery, it's sound, it's music, and it's quickly and easily available. And that's the attention competition that's kind of being propositioned between reading and any other I'll call it artistic medium for the sake of discussion. Whether a TikTok video is art or not is up for debate. I would say. Um, but the point there is when it comes down to music, 100%. Like again, so Toby Fox is he made Undertale pretty well solo, minus some I think art. Um, but that's both he both had to compose that music, which is in and of itself one skill. So ignoring entirely the fact that there's a video game behind it, just composing a piece of music is just one discipline. There's another part where you don't know how long your music is going to be played. Some can be set to just play throughout, and that's the scene. Like it's a cutscene, so you can design music to play to that cutscene. Or you might be making music set to an exploration. So there's a player that's going around this arbitrary area, and they have to have music being played based on this tone and this idea, maybe this theme. For how long they'll be there, who knows? Maybe they'll get stuck there for 30 minutes. Maybe they'll blow through it in 7. So it's got to be a coherent thesis as far as composition is concerned. Um, the other issue is that it's got to be easily crossfaded. If you move from one area to the next, is it jarring when the music stops and then another piece of music starts playing? No, there's usually a crossfade, or there's a like a dimming that occurs before the next one plays, like it finishes playing. That's part of sound design. But again, that's a whole. We're talking about basically what one, two, three different disciplines on top of writing that we have to consider when when we include the sound engineering as part of a video game storytelling.
Yeah, and I could buy or argue that that alone, just the fact that you've got all these skills that are, they're really whole art forms, I would argue in and of themselves. Um, for one person to be able to do all of it is actually it's like the Renaissance man. That's why I called you that from the beginning, because when you said you're doing the sound and the art and the writing and the programming, right? So once you've got all of those, it's almost like, someone coming to you and they're a polyglot, right? Like speak like seven languages and just sit there and think, how the hell are you doing this, man? Uh,
Poorly.
though I wish, do you think in your experience going across mediums, do you think that there is a way that I kind of asked this question with comics, and the answer with that was kind of not really, but a way to cross apply skills. And the reason I ask is because, when I wrote my first novel, I had a character that was basically Satan, and I wanted him to like have the voice of Ron Perlman. Uh, but I, for the life of me, could not figure out how to, like, I wanted the reader to feel that voice, right? And I could not. I tried for days and days and days, just, fucking around with this tiny bit of dialogue. I don't think I could ever do it. Um, or I've also wanted to do something like, I'll call back to Dark Souls, when you go and criticize the boss fight to hell and back, if you will, but when you go to fight Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, and you have this soft, tragic piano piece playing in contrast to what should be this final and long awaited moment against the final boss. um Something when you have that contrast between the tone of what's going on and the difficulty with which your character is faced and the action that's happening. I've never quite been able to capture all of that um in writing in a way that you can once you introduce, let's say in this case, music. Have you been able to take any of those skills from adding those elements into games into your writing, or is this just like a thing that games have this advantage and written works do not?
Well, it definitely is a challenge because we're talking about kind of dimensionality to the art. So when we're looking at books, like historically, they are, they're sequential and linear, and they have only one output, which is the words on the page. So they're a fairly straightforward medium to output. But as you mentioned before, when we start adding all of these different outputs to the consumer, um, there's the potential for depth, and I'm sure there's been more examples of failures than successes in there. But for every, I would say, for every dimension of complexity that's added, it becomes that much more exponentially like easier to fail. So how do we convey specific uh, additional emotions? Like how do we take a one-dimensional item and make it four dimensions, basically, which is quite the challenge. And I think it's probably, at least this is my solution, because it's probably easier to leverage the strengths of the medium rather than trying to chase down the experiences of others. So the strength of writing, the strength of a book is to convey knowledge, and it's sort of in ways that a video game can't. So you can definitely write a program that will output text on the screen. That's what a Kindle is. It's a little tiny computer that you hold in your hand, and it displays text. Um, but on the flip side, to make a video game that would have as much content as a novel would be infinitesimally more challenging. There's other ways you can tell the story, of course, which will condense down the development time, which will condense down the amount of time that the player has to spend in order to get to completion. But to, I don't think, I'm not quite sure that experiencing a symphony can ever be the same as reading a book, and that's kind of what we're talking about. there's a symphony, right? You go to the orchestra and listen to a fantastic musical piece. It will, you know, psychologically and neurologically speaking, it will hit different parts of your brain than reading a fantastic book. They're just two different dimensions of experience. Um, how do we square the circle for that? I don't know if it's even possible to. Because when you read a book, sometimes like you'll feel emotions and you'll understand situations. The whole point of books in the beginning wasn't really fiction. Like fiction's all right, you can roll me for this. I'm going to make this stipulation. Fiction is a relatively new concept. We do have instances of it occurring in the late Greek period, but it was as far as our examples of it, it's immensely rare. You can maybe Shakespeare is the first instance of like I don't know fantasy, for instance. Um, but for the most part, books and paper were fairly rare, so they were meant to convey knowledge and critical ideas and things that push forward, human society, like merchant ledgers and things of that nature. If you can afford it, you can maybe make a piece of fiction, or maybe you could consider a lot of travel logs that were written back in the day fiction. Who knows? Um, so playing to that strength of of you can't engage the readers all of their senses. Like you can give them a little bit of imagination as far as what something smells. If it smells putrid or rotting body, I'm pretty sure you've at least smelled a rotten piece of meat once in your life. That's pretty universal almost. um you know if you've smelled a kind flower, clearly you can play on things of that nature. Novels rely on relatability for the most part. And as far as I understand, like a reader has to have experienced it in order for it to land. Um, and I don't know how to square that circle. Like video games, you can produce a sound, you can produce an image that will give someone a relative idea of what you're trying to do. If a demon has horns, you could draw a really gnarly looking demon and put horns on it, and it's like this is a demon with horns. And it's like, oh, okay. You could describe a demon with horns, but you'll have to have seen or understood or seen a picture of something with horns, if that makes any sense.
It does, and it kind of leads us to the conclusion that really different mediums do, in fact, have their strengths and weaknesses, and you kind of have to, or don't have to, but it's ideal to play into those strengths. And obviously, you do what you can for the weaknesses, but it would it's better off because of that exponential failure problem, particularly as you get into something as complex as a game, to not try and be, let's say, perfect or even great in all dimensions of, let's say, user experience. One thing you said, it was kind of offhand, so maybe we'd walk it back. But you said that one of the greatest strengths for written fiction was knowledge, and that was in reference to the fact that when you're dealing with a game, you have to program each individual thing, and it's a lot more expensive and time consuming, and there's a lot of higher skill requirements for each component, whereas you only really need one particular skill set as an author. You put the words there, and then the words are there, right? A lot lower barrier to entry. I would actually argue that the biggest strength with written fiction comes with interiority. What I mean by that is the internal experience and feelings of the characters. I've noticed that you can only get either spoken or superficial details through other mediums, or you can use music as a proxy. And there's an argument to be made that music and sound can, uh, let's say, overcome anything described, let's say, in fiction. If I was Nietzsche when he was young and part of Richard Wagner's music cult, I might make that argument. But I'm going to press now that really, when it comes to fiction, it's that the feeling of the character, the internal thoughts, as best as they could be described. Um, I think that perhaps might be the fiction's greatest strength. And I want to draw a comparison to a game that I've mentioned before, Dark Souls, because um, I want to highlight the only time I can really think of where this interiority was covered in a way that I don't think I've seen replicable in in fiction, and it comes with the gameplay. So there's a narrative component in the Dark Souls franchise, for those of you who don't know, where your character is undead and they're always, there's always a risk that they'll go insane when they lose their humanity, which is called going hollow. Now, just talking about the context of the first game, what happens is that the character, when they go hollow, they give in to despair, right? It's that's the narrative explanation, and then they lose who they were, giving into despair, become a hollow husk of themselves, essentially reduced to a wild animal. Okay, so how does that relate to interiority? Well, if you pay attention, you know, you resurrect at a bonfire every time you die in that game. I would argue that there is a point where you don't resurrect at the bonfire in Dark Souls, and that's when you get so frustrated and angry that you rage quit and you walk away. And when you recognize, let's say, oh, I just died for real. I like my emotions got too much and I gave into despair and I gave up. And now I'm dead. Like that's what it means to fall down and to not be able to proceed. And when I realized that, there's something, touched me deep down where I thought that was fucking impressive. To never tell anyone that is part of the game mechanics, but to have it be present there and for the player to realize. Um, and now, why did I just go on that long spiel? I'm curious if you have any other examples, because you likely have more than I do, where the player interiority that would normally be described secondhand through a fiction, which is, I would argue, fiction's strength, can be imparted directly into the player as a you can almost argue that that is deeper than what fiction does. That's arguable. I don't know. Do you have any examples where something like that happens, where the game mechanics uh, essentially create interiority for the player in such a way that fiction can communicate feelings, deep emotions?
I think in a similar way, Near Automata does something similar. So Near Automata is like a post-apocalyptic story about androids that descend from space and are trying to. Um, it depends on which story you're going through, but effectively either investigate or um, save humanity. Uh, but there is a specific point. So I don't think it's as complex as Dark Souls. Dark Souls has a lot of layers to it, but I think why Nier Automata was so uh, at least so much of a cult classic was because at the very end, so you don't have to beat Nier Automata once, you have to beat it three times on three different characters, and that's what you have to do this in order to get to the complete ending of the game. Like that's the finale. Um, and there's a moment in time where you have two options, right? And you're at the very end of your journey. You can pick two roads. On one road, you can call for help. And if you call for help, you get to the end. Or you can sacrifice yourself to help someone else and it deletes your save. You have to start all over again. So there's it ties into the narrative where um, kind of selfishness and greed had destroyed a lot of the world. And it plays on kind of the characters that you end up with at the end of the third run. It plays into that where You can be greedy and selfish and take the ending, or you can be selfless and help someone else get to the end. And it ties into the characters very well.
That's
But
interesting. So let me make sure I understand right. Though if you sacrifice yourself, it deletes your save. Um, now my question is, does that does that communicate what they were hoping it would, right? Like to um, because it seems like they've does that is still helping someone else as a virtue, or does that make the because the question narratively speaking is what does that do? Let's say I guess you could say it tests the player. Like, are you virtuous enough to lose your save file, or are you going to take the easy way out?
well, effectively, like throughout this long journey, again, you have to beat the game 3 times in effect to get to this point. Um, Throughout all of these stories, the theme is relatively similar. There's a lot of sacrifice made on part of the character and by proxy the player. Um, there are certain characters that die. I'm not going to spoil anything. There's certain characters that die, certain characters that survive, uh, certain parts of the story that kind of reveal. I'll put it no other way because of the seven deadly sins. They touch upon a lot of them. There's a lot of sinful, um, unvirtuous, if you prefer that word, um, underpinnings that cause the world to get into this uh, pretty much destroyed state. So then the question is like it's a test of character. You've been through all of this. You've been through each of these stories. You know everything that happens up to this point. Do you want your payout and what you perceive as the just dessert, or will you be someone who makes a change for the better? Is effectively what that proposition is.
Nice. Well, I'm happy that there are other games out there that are, let's say, putting that interiority deep into the mechanics, giving the player some reason for self-reflection. All right, Matt, we've been going for about a little over an hour and a half, probably an hour and 40 minutes now, something close to that. So we've got to wrap things up. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we go to the outro?
For sure. I just before we wrap up, I just wanted to touch on one last thing that you were speaking to about writing. And I think that there is a multifaceted discipline to writing. And hopefully I didn't seem like I'm throwing writing under the bus. Quite the opposite. But as a final touch point, I want to kind of note the kind of special superpower of the writer is to be a seasoned and in the world. Um, so I'll just compare contrast. In my opinion, today we're kind of noticing a lull in, let's just say, genre fiction, um, where things aren't very engaging. But if we look back, some of the greatest works that for the most part, the community reveres in fantasy and science fiction, we'll say, have been um, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and they're both veterans of World War One. So I want to throw it out there that the the toolbox for the writer is to have experienced the world for better or for worse. And hopefully I can end on that note where I didn't rail on writers or anything like that because that was not my intent at all.
I don't think that anyone thought that that conversation, or rather that, let's say, mentioning of the experience of the author. I think that's going to tie into a conversation I'm going to have. I've already got him lined up with Nathaniel Cumberledge again because he'll be featuring this week on our novel, where we talk about the inspirations for works and originality. And I think that topic is going to come up. So uh, if you, Matt, or if any of those listeners are interested in that, or that's gonna, be a good follow up. Um, and also, I don't think we railed on writers too much. I do think that, like we've said, it's this particular skill set, and you develop yourself as a person, and then you make yourself excellent in your singular art, and other arts are more multivarious, and you have to juggle many things, and they're all equally worthwhile pursuits. All right, everybody. Before we go, I'll take a moment to shill again. If you want to take part of this podcast, contact me or contact someone who knows me, who you know, who would be willing to vouch for you, and I'd love to get you on. Also, you can recommend topics. I don't know if I mentioned that at the beginning. I should have. So if you've got a topic that you want to hear discussed, you can leave a comment on. I'll post this up on YouTube, or you can submit it to me directly. An easy way to do that is to go to my website, wildislelit.com, and go to the contact page. While you're there, check out my editing service, the Wild Isle Style Guide, if you've got a manuscript you want to get in tip top shape. Also, you can check out my novel, Wand Smoke Broken, the weird fantasy, Western esque literary type of weird thing that I've got out there. First chapter is available for free. I even did a little audio recording forever ago, so the quality is probably terrible. I apologize, but it's worthwhile checking out. Let me know what you think. And Matt, go ahead and throw out where people can get a hold of you or keep up with your work.
Yeah, I post my comings and goings on Twitter at Forgotten ADV.
All right. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. I really enjoyed having you. If you want to participate again, you could always
Thank
let me
you.
know. Yeah, you're welcome, man. And I'll see you next time.